we know hunter-gatherers when we see them? If there's cutting CDs and doing ecotourism. In the last chapter, you may remember, in the middle of all that hyper academic stuff, you find out there's a big discrepancy between the younger hunters who use snowmobiles all the time and go from place to place, like hunting, specialized hunting, basically using a snowmobile. So, they're using snowmobiles. They are surely, certainly today, using cell phones and all the wonderful stuff. So what I'm trying to say here is that technology, or the use of horses, guns, those kinds of things, snowmobiles, can't be our dividing line. So if we're studying hunter-gatherers, what's the difference? What makes them hunter-gatherers as opposed to just, I don't know, me in a flannel shirt and jeans? Or let me give you a different example. When I was growing up in Montana, there were cows that belonged to our neighbor, but they just wandered around because there was a law that if you didn't want cows on your property, you had to fence them out. It was your responsibility as the property owners. These cows would just go wandering around, sometimes get lost, have to find them. Usually had traveled together, so it wasn't that hard. One time we had a cow for a while, and then it became time to butcher the cow. We didn't know how to do that. We weren't really native to Montana, so got this person to do it. And I still remember, I went out to the field where this cow was, and to butcher it, he went up to it with a pistol and shot it in the head. Right there, dropped the cow. Question, was I a hunter-gatherer with these cows wandering around, shooting a cow? Does that make me a hunter? No, says Gabe. Why not, though? What's the difference?
I feel like that was too easy.
Too easy. Well, yeah, but let's say that these hunters say that the animals are giving themselves to the hunter. That's easy, right? They look them in the eye with that look of love, boom, shot. I'm a hunter now.
Your survival didn't depend on that cow.
Oh, you didn't grow up in Montana with me. Our survival definitely did depend on that cow. That was good stuff. What's the difference between the cow and the caribou?
The caribou has that response to stare forward and then run.
Cow should have ran off. Where? So I guess I would say, if you can't draw the line at technology, it has to be that somehow, right, the hunters and gatherers are gathering wild plants, and the caribou is wild. The cow is not wild. That's what makes it easy, right? Even though it might get lost, me wandering around, it's still. And even though I was living in Montana, I wasn't really in the wilderness, the true wilderness. I wasn't far enough away that I'm have a fire for my coffee pot or whatever. We did have a wood stove and all that. So, if you think about the definition of what makes someone a hunter-gatherer, if you're going to study them anthropologically, I think it has to be that they're dealing with wild stuff as opposed to domesticated plants, as opposed to a cow, a domesticated animal, and as opposed to a domestic or a home or a, that's where we get the word from, the domicile of the house, which encompasses these lines. So, I want to start out with that because, in fact, the people Brody are studying, or even the people that we mention here using snowmobiles and all those things, what then makes them hunter-gatherers. But if you were the anthropologist, and then you went out and you're doing your anthropological study, and you ask people, well, how are those wild plants that you got from the forest today? They would be puzzled by your use of the word wild, because as Ingold says, citing a very famous book, I think Turnbull, as I mentioned, was also an ethnomusicologist, helped record that CD. This book and others kind of earned him more fame in the UK and US than most anthropologists get. But Ingold here, drawing on Turnbull's work, says that, you know, for the people in that place, the Mbudi, they would say they wouldn't think of the forest as some sort of wild, out there plants as growing undomesticated. They actually refer to them as father or mother. They do so because, quote, because they say it gives them food, warmth, shelter, and clothing, just like their parents. And like their parents, it gives them affection, which is an interesting word to use about the forest, but we can go with it. Also here, drawing on the work of Nurit David, I think would be how you'd say her last name, and some, at the time, some articles that she was writing about foragers. We'll talk about foragers in a bit. And if you ask the hunters about their wild animals, and we've been through this a little bit, they would not necessarily think of the animals as out of control or wild. They would say, no, that look of love, the animals shared or gave themselves to the people. And that in fact, they were engaged. Hunting itself comes to be regarded not as a technical manipulation of the natural world, but as a kind of interpersonal dialogue. And I guess here, Gabe, might as well have you jump in here. What a interpersonal dialogue? What the heck are they talking about? What in the hunter world are the animals?
Oh, I think, I forget the person Ingold quoted, but in Cree, in like the Cree language, person is just like basically just living being. And so there's no like distinction between human and like animal. Like in Western like thought, we usually think of like, oh, humans, there's like some aspect to humanity that like puts us at a higher status than animals. In like the Cree cosmology,
We'll go with that. That sounds good.
there is no distinction. It's just each is a living being.
Right. I guess I would say there is a distinction. I mean, they're very attuned to the differences. But what the distinction is, or the different, both are persons actually, or can be persons. And so it's not, it's kind of like they're different. So I think as you put it, and as Ingo puts it, in the Western view, you have persons, people, humans, and animals out there, which are categorically different. And then we bridge out with similarities. Whereas in the Cree, they're categorically the same, both persons, both alive. And then you look for differences within that essential similarity that they are living. They're both living. And I guess I would say, you know, and They both can have points of view. They both attend to each other. And you know, if we keep going, if we push the life thing, the living thing a little bit, we usually talk about living beings and living things as if they are things that have the property of life inside them. Whereas for the Cree, life is the process, and we're sort of being produced by that. As it's kind of hard for me to describe, but it's, you know, it's that life is a continual process which is holding us together as forms, or we're taking up a momentary, we're taking up a place in the process of life. I might need, I wasn't expecting to go all super philosophical here. I might need to come into the text a tiny bit. Aha, yes. This is on page 51. For the Cree, life has a different meaning. Scott tells us that the term Pimatisiwin, life was translated by one Cree man as continuous birth. To be alive is to be situated within a field of relations which, as it unfolds actively and ceaselessly, brings forms into being. Humans as humans, geese as geese, and so on. Far from revealing forms that are always specified, life is the process of their ongoing generation. All right, that was, I think, maybe better than I tried to explain. So, well, let me go one more sentence. Every living being then emerges as a particular positioned embodiment of this generative potential. So we are sort of, instead of thinking life is inside of us, we are in life, you might say. Maybe. I don't know. Well, you're looking at me like I might be crazy. Huh? No? Okay. All right. So far, so good, maybe. Oh, yes, he's drawing on several people among the Cree, one of them this book by Adrian Tanner, Bringing Home Animals. So some stuff on there. In any case, the issue is that animals, that non-human animals and humans are both different kinds of persons, and they both have points of view, and to hunt is to engage with them. My third question, life in the wilderness. PowerPoint gave me a lot of stuff this class when I started typing in wild kinds of things, all kinds of good images. Interestingly, here, they would say that they do not perceive themselves to be sort of in a different world, in a wild world, or in some sort of natural world, which is different from a home world. And so they don't feel confronted by wilderness. This is on page 57. They are, as their ethnographers have noted, as the anthropologists have noted, as Ingold says, with some surprise, else they would not have cared to remark on the fact, thoroughly at home in the world. The Pintupi, Myers tells us, seem truly at home as they walk through the bush, full of confidence. So drawing on an older work here by Fred Myers about Aborigines, indigenous people in Australia, and how they are confidently, completely at home in the Western desert there. So on the one hand, what we could say then is that this is amazing. And the reason I'm putting it this way is because we don't want to necessarily say that the hunter-gatherers don't have any culture, right? They have to have a culture because all people have culture. And we don't want to say that they don't, because that sounds like we'd be taking away culture from them, right? And that's been the problem. And so all of these anthropologists have had the, have believed or have gone to the people and studied with them and from them and learned from them as fellow human beings with all the capacities that human beings have. And we assume that one of those key characteristics of human beings is having culture. And so we could say then that, okay, the hunter-gatherer cultural construction of nature. So our cultural construction of nature is that there is nature out there and us over here. There's society, nature, all those divides, wild, domestic. But in their point of view, they don't see themselves as different from nature. And so that's great. We can go for a swim, because that's what PowerPoint told me to do in that. Jump into the natural world, just like that. So we have a different cultural construction. However, if we think about those geese and wild animals, right? How do we know then if they don't think the animals are wild, then why are we even calling them the hunters and gatherers of wild animals? So the geese they have a point of view. They're attending to the hunters, and the hunters are attending to them. Is at the bottom of page 51. Human hunters, for their part, attend to the presence of geese in the knowledge that geese are attending to them. And the geese are learning. And then as Ingold says on page 52, in this regard, dealing with non-human animals is not fundamentally different from dealing with fellow humans. And so we could say that that's interesting and that's really good. But what we, the anthropologists, would say, I think, is that, all right, fine, but these geese, animals in general, are modeled on people and social relations, but they're not really persons, right? That's your idea of them, what you got from society. And in terms of the landscape out there being wild, we would say, well, that's simply your cultural ideas being put onto or pinned onto the natural world. And I think the reason I'm hesitating here is I feel like I left out one of my old slides, which is about the plants and the forest and the mother and the father part. We would again say that that is a metaphor, right? That what they're doing is extending what they know from the human world, the father and mother, onto the forest. And so they are speaking like a metaphor. On the issue of the landscape and what people see in it, I think I've never been struck so much by the kind of things that happen when they take Brody out to that cross out in the woods. They said, they kept saying, hey, we got to go see the cross. Gonna go see this thing. Make sure you see it. What happens when they get there, Willa?
We don't really acknowledge it that much. They're not like, oh, this symbolizes this to us. And Brody's like, what?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it takes They said hardly more than a quick walk turned out to be a round trip of 14 miles that took 4 hours. So it takes a long time and a long way to get there. And then as soon as they get there, they're like, pretty much time to turn around. And Rhodey seems kind of confused by all this. They seem to only care that they'd been there. And I think, he said, I think he quoted its very lack of grandeur, this is on page 108, and limited physical life signify in ways that Joseph and Apton would never feel needed to be stated, both the vitality of the hunter's mind and the irrelevance to it of grandiose material encumbrances. And so, it's kind of this funny passage, but in some ways it did remind me of things that Ingold was talking about with that, with the Aboriginal understanding of the dreaming and the kind of way in which the land figures and the shifting ways in which camps sort of are made new. And then this is on page 53 of Ingold, which is, what Myers calls a country can also mean camp, a place temporarily constituted by virtue of the everyday activities of a group of people who happen to set up there. And so they don't necessarily endure, but they become part of this overall landscape of meaning, which they are constantly walking in or through. So again, this brings us back to this idea that is common in anthropology, and Ingold has actually begun his chapter. We now go back to where he began, which is that there are different cultures who have different cultural constructions of the natural and the cultural. And in a hunter-gatherer cultural construction, they wouldn't see themselves as different from nature. And I think from Ingold's point of view, there would be a few problems with this. The first is that, as we talked in the first chapter, there's still this kind of arrogance to it, that we, the anthropologists, have pulled ourselves up and outside of culture so that we can survey all the cultures of the world, but they appear to be stuck in it. They can't even see that it's their own cultural construction. And so, as Ingold says, this is the only world they know. And so for us to be saying, oh, well, when you say father, when you call the forest father, you're speaking metaphorically about, the people as father, and then extending that onto the forest. It can't be that the forest is actually, it can't be that the forest is actually giving you affection. That must be a metaphor that you're using from the human world. And so in some ways, it's still not taking people seriously. Again, more seriously than people were taken before the anthropologists perhaps arrived. And it also leads to, and this I don't entirely understand as well, these kinds of logical conundrums, which was this figure 3.1, where you have, culture and nature, culture constructing a world in the Western sense in which culture is separate from nature. And as Ingold puts it, it's a world of infinite regress. You have to, well, then what is the culture that constructs that culture? It leads you into logical issues. So I think there is some key issues or key explanations for what Ingold is trying to get at on page 42. And sometimes I recommend reading this page about 10 different times. And I certainly have. I'm not sure that I get it yet, but sometimes I feel like I'm getting closer. So what Ingold is saying is the hunter-gatherers don't grapple with a natural that is separate from the culture. They don't see themselves as confronting a natural world out there. They see it as fundamentally all the same world. But he goes on to say that what he is not trying to say or that he is not arguing, is that they have a distinctive worldview or are somehow closer to nature. So he's trying to distance himself from this idea that they are, how to say, that they're in some ways fundamentally more pure or perhaps even more correct. What he is saying is, well, there's the quote, they are not peculiar in this regard. If you go back to the page 57, where Myers was talking about how the people in Australia were thoroughly at home, truly at home as they walk through the bush, full of confidence. They are no more their lands are no more a wilderness than are farmlands to a farmer or streets to a city dweller. And then this is the key part. As this statement implies, it is not because of his occupancy of a built environment that the urban dweller feels at home on the streets. It is because they are the streets of his neighborhood, along which they are accustomed to walk or drive in their everyday life, presenting familiar faces, sights, and sounds. And so what Ingold is saying here is that all of us can and do feel this way, not because human beings need to live in built urban environments or in towns, or it's because we're going to feel at home where we feel at home, or we're going to feel at home in our home because we are in the streets of our neighborhood, and where we drive along in everyday life. So what the point is that in fact, in some ways, this is not that different for being a hunter-gatherer, and that they are, like us, immersed from the start, like other creatures, in an active, practical, and perceptual engagement with constituents of the dwelt-in world. And that this is actually the human condition. This is the way things are. The human condition is being immersed in active and practical and perceptual engagement with constituents of the dwelt-in world. And so what he's saying here is this is not an alternative view. It's not a view of, but it's a view in. Which is why perhaps I hesitated a bit, gave it the word cosmology, because that is precisely that we all have different cosmologies or views of the world. Whereas what Ingold is trying to tell us is that there's an insight here into how we all live in the world, not just our perception of it. Now, like I said, this is difficult for me to understand, and I've tried sometimes to read and reread it to see if I'm messed up, or maybe Ingold's messed up, hard to say. And I think there's some questions that we can ask about this. And if I'm not mistaken, Willa, I think you were kind of asking these, but let me know if that's correct. The first question is, wait a second. Who is Ingold talking about with this Western point of view, etc.? Yeah, and I think that's a fair question. I think for the most part, and I think you said this, for the most part, he is talking about what he called one of my favorite phrases. That's not page 58, sorry, that's page 38. The people who call themselves scientists, right? Those people who are trying to understand philosophize, go out, examine other people's points of view. And we're trying, the people who go out and study the hunter-gatherers, who consider themselves to be scientists, I think that's his main target, is the people who are trying to construct models for how we behave in the world. But I think this was on one of your other questions, if I'm not mistaken. So if Ingold is saying this is the human condition and we can all access it, then how did the Westerners get messed up? Are we all messed up? Is it ethnocentric to say that we're messed up? Does that make sense? Is that kind of on track? Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And like I said, I think Ingold himself would say, if you look at the successive prefaces to his book over time, that he has been accused of too romanticizing this human dwelling condition. And in fact, he has stopped using the word dwelling and he calls it inhabitant, being an inhabitant of the world, because the word dwelling has this, as he puts it, this wrapped coziness about it. And so, you know, I mean, I think he's not trying to romanticize another point of view, and he's not trying to say that the West is sort of fundamentally messed up in a way that others are not. But, you know, we also have to wonder, well, who are these Westerners? And let's start to think about this. And this is where also I think that in some ways, we need to pay attention to some things that Ingold was not thinking about, or wasn't quite as thinking about them as now as we might be in our present world, about issues of race, about issues of gender. And what the Western thought, I think I mentioned this a couple classes ago, maybe we should just say, well, that's the kind of point of view that comes from settler colonialism. And Ingold gets close to saying that in a couple chapters, but he doesn't bring it out the way that people would bring it out in today's world. And I think if I'm portraying this correctly, this is the idea that some humans are better than other humans, right? That there is a ranking within the human world between the humans at the top and the humans that are not at the top, and but that humans are different and better categorically than animals. Oh, and I should say that we in the settler colonial Western world, enforce this hierarchy by attributing the people that the West wants to put at the bottom by either dehumanizing them or attributing all sorts of animal characteristics to them. So this is kind of classic, as a classic racist tactic to animalize or to try and you know, to otherwise dehumanize other people in order to enforce this hierarchy. And that humans, I guess I should bring in another thing, which is, you know, man above woman. But that man also is over dominating, has been given domination to nature. And so, you know, I mean, I think that as we might say that in the West, that Ingold is here speaking mostly to those who want to assume the mantle of science and philosophy, but there's also this is a deep thing in our own society. I don't think we can deny that these things are also true way down the line, you might say, or way deep in places where people are in these kinds of real life situations. Now, I don't want to defer the answer to your questions well too long, but I will say that some of them, I think, are going to be answered in the next chapter, upcoming on Tuesday in chapter 4, which talks about kind of the place of the hunter-gatherer in Western thought. So there's something, there is some of this coming up. But again, I think that what Ingold is arguing for is that, yes, in some ways, we need to take up this perspective of lived-in engagement to reorient humans. But in some ways, how to say, now where'd I go? But we also have to look at this as a component of, this overwhelming ideology of colonialism, settlement, imperialism. And so this can be taken up at kind of levels all down the line, if you're in, in strange places where you wouldn't expect it to be. Certainly, if I'm thinking about, people I was studying in Colombia in South America, who would be, sort of agricultural peasant farming types, but might very much have this same idea of sort of man over nature and themselves over people out there who are in the wild, that would very much look like what we consider to be Western thought. So it does kind of it can trickle down, so to speak, or it can be enforced on the bottom. And I think you turn to these passages in Brodie, I think that are right on about this, or show us how this happens in a very practical way among, or in the Canadian, in this Canadian frontier. And so, this book is called Maps and Dreams, and we usually think about, well, he's talked about, the hunting dreams and those kinds of things. But here, he is starting to say that, the people with the crazy dream, the white man's dream, is that, we're going to go in and cut down all the forest and farm it and have a big dam and get a bunch of power, and then we're going to drill and we're going to put a pipeline in here, and we're just going to, basically run this place like an extraction point to feed feed literally with food and feed the energy needs of our population in our world. And so Brodie here goes through, these different they have the like I said, the hydroelectric dam, there's the railways that come in, there's all the settlers that come in, the ranchers, this town that puts up. And so, what Brodie is saying is, I mean, he's not romanticizing, he's not saying that this is like, virgin forest, loaded word right there. The idea this is some untouched forest, that this has been places that have been subjected to various projects, various frontiers. And so, if we put in a pipeline here, it's not going to, it's just going to be another, it's going to be another thing, another addition to these previous frontiers. And so it's not going to be, he says, a scar on virgin lands. And I think he's using that in a way to indicate that that's a wrong way to think about the land. And then he ends his chapter, or at least we end our reading for today with the vital questions still remain. Is there an indigenous system on these lands? Is this system a practical reality of today? And so, as you're reading the next assignment in Brodie, starting on page 136, I'd ask you to look at these, to keep these questions in mind. The vital questions. Is there an indigenous system on these lands? So the first question is there a system? If you remember back to the Las Casas Sepulveda dispute, is there even something that is worth preserving? Is there a system? And then the second question is this system a practical reality of today? As we just saw in the 1981 film, they are living in the present, but does that mean it is still a possible reality?